The shovel struck something soft beneath 3 feet of Montana snow, and Sarah Mitchell's heart stopped. What she had thought was frozen ground gave way to reveal a small hand, blue with cold, but still moving, still alive, standing in the middle of nowhere, 20 miles from the nearest town. With a blizzard approaching and no way to call for help, Sarah faced a choice that would transform her from a desperate mail-order bride into something she never knew she could become. Because that firsthand led to a second child, then a third, then 15 children buried alive in snow caves, surviving on nothing but hope and each other's warmth. What happened next would prove that sometimes the people we're trying to escape from become the very ones we're meant to save. But first, let's go back to the beginning to understand how a woman fleeing her past became the guardian angel these children had been praying for. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell had always believed that desperation made people do terrible things. Standing on the platform of Whitefish Station in northern Montana, clutching a worn leather suitcase and a crumpled letter from a man she'd never met, she was beginning to understand just how terrible those things could be. The November wind cut through her thin coat like a knife, carrying the scent of snow and pine that reminded her why she had chosen this remote corner of America. Not because it was beautiful, though the towering mountains surrounding the valley took her breath away. Not because it promised opportunity, though the letter in her coat pocket spoke of a comfortable life on a cattle ranch. She had chosen Montana because it was as far from Philadelphia as a person could get, without leaving the country entirely. At 28, Sarah had learned that geography was sometimes the only solution to problems that couldn't be reasoned, negotiated with or escaped through conventional means. The bruises on her ribs had finally healed during the 4-day train journey west, but the memory of how she'd gotten them remained as sharp as the mountain air that now filled her lungs. Her husband of 3 years, Thomas Caldwell, had possessed the kind of charm that convinced everyone he met that Sarah was the luckiest woman in Philadelphia. Handsome, successful in his import business, generous with gifts and public displays of affection. What they hadn't seen were the private moments when his charm curdled into something darker, the way his hands became weapons when Sarah asked too many questions about his business associates. The nights when she lay awake listening to him move through their house like a predator, checking locks and peering through curtains at shadows that might or might not exist. The end had come 3 months ago when Sarah discovered the real source of Thomas's prosperity. Hidden in their basement, behind false walls she'd stumbled upon during spring cleaning, were crates of merchandise that definitely hadn't come through any legitimate import business. Opium from China, smuggled in tea, containers, stolen jewelry from New York society families, documents that appeared to be forged immigration papers. When Thomas found her in the basement that night, standing among evidence of his criminal enterprises, his reaction had been swift and terrifying. The beating that followed left her with 2 cracked ribs, a black eye that took weeks to heal, and the absolute certainty that staying in Philadelphia would eventually cost her life. But leaving Thomas Caldwell hadn't been as simple as packing a bag and boarding a train. Men like Thomas had connections, resources, and the kind of stubborn pride that made them pursue what they considered their property across any distance. Sarah had needed more than escape. She had needed transformation into someone else entirely. The solution had come through a newspaper advertisement she'd discovered while hiding in the Philadelphia Public Library, researching train schedules to distant cities. "Matrimonial correspondence invited," the small print announced. "Respectable gentleman rancher seeks companionate marriage with refined lady. Montana Territory offers opportunity for new beginnings far from Eastern complications." The advertisement, had been placed by one James Harrison of Cedar Creek Ranch, whose subsequent letters painted a picture of life that seemed designed specifically for someone seeking to disappear. A cattle operation 30 miles from the nearest town, a comfortable but isolated ranch house, where a woman could help manage domestic operations while enjoying the security of marriage to a man who valued privacy and self-reliance above social connections. James Harrison's letters had been formal, but kind, describing a life of honest work and mutual respect rather than passionate romance. He was 42, he wrote, a widower whose first wife had died in childbirth 5 years earlier. He needed a partner to help manage his household and, perhaps, eventually, to help him build the family he'd always wanted. In exchange, he offered financial security, protection, and what he called the kind of freedom that comes from living where your nearest neighbor is far enough away to mind their own business. The arrangement suited Sarah's needs perfectly. Marriage to James Harrison would provide legal protection from Thomas's inevitable attempts to reclaim her. The remote location would make it nearly impossible for Thomas to track her down. Most importantly, the identity change from Sarah Caldwell to Sarah Harrison would create a legal barrier that might discourage even Thomas's criminal associates from pursuing her across a continent. The correspondence had continued for 6 weeks, with Sarah using a false address and careful language that revealed nothing about her true circumstances. James Harrison's letters grew warmer as their exchange progressed, revealing a man who seemed genuinely interested in partnership rather than possession. He wrote about his cattle, his land, his dreams of building something lasting in the Montana wilderness. His letters contained none of the controlling undertones that had characterized Thomas's courtship, none of the subtle threats disguised as protection. When James finally proposed marriage by mail, offering to pay her travel expenses, and promising a simple ceremony upon her arrival, Sarah had accepted with relief that bordered on desperation. Whatever risks might await her in Montana, they couldn't be worse than the certainty of violence that awaited her in Philadelphia. The train journey west had provided 4 days to consider what she was doing. 4 days to watch the familiar landscapes of her childhood disappear behind her, replaced by endless prairies, and finally by mountains that seemed to touch the sky. 4 days to practice being Sarah Mitchell, the name she'd chosen for her new identity, complete with forged papers that identified her as a seamstress from Boston seeking opportunity in the Western Territories. The deception troubled her conscience, but necessity overruled moral qualms. James Harrison was expecting to marry a woman who didn't exist, but the alternative was remaining married to a man who might kill her. Sometimes, survival required choices that couldn't be measured against conventional standards of honesty. Now, standing on the platform at Whitefish Station, with snow beginning to fall and daylight already fading despite the early hour, Sarah wondered if she had simply exchanged one form of uncertainty for another. The letter in her coat pocket contained detailed directions to Cedar Creek Ranch, but those directions assumed she would be met at the station by James Harrison himself. The platform was deserted except for the station master, who had disappeared into his office after the train departed. "You waiting for someone?" The voice belonged to an elderly man who emerged from the station building carrying a lantern that cast dancing shadows across the snow-covered platform. "Storm's coming in faster than expected. Anybody planning to meet you should have been here by now." Sarah consulted James Harrison's letter again, though she had memorized its contents during the long train ride. "I'm supposed to meet James Harrison, and from Cedar Creek Ranch. He said he'd be here when the afternoon train arrived." The station master's expression grew concerned. "Cedar Creek's a good piece from here, maybe 30 miles through mountain country. With this weather moving in, it's possible James got delayed or decided to wait until conditions improve." He gestured toward the swirling snow that was already beginning to accumulate on the platform. "You're welcome to wait inside where it's warm, But I should warn you that if he doesn't show up soon, you might be stuck here until the storm passes." The prospect of spending an indefinite period stranded at a remote train station filled Sarah with anxiety that had nothing to do with physical discomfort. Every day she remained in one place increased the chances that Thomas's people might track her down. She had chosen Montana specifically because it offered the kind of isolation that made pursuit difficult. But that isolation was meaningless if she never reached her destination. How would someone get to Cedar Creek Ranch without waiting for Mr. Harrison? Sarah asked, though she suspected the answer wouldn't be encouraging. The station master studied her city clothes and single suitcase with obvious skepticism. In good weather, with proper equipment and someone who knows the country, it's maybe a 6-hour ride by horseback or wagon. In weather like this, he shook his head. "Mom, I've lived in these mountains for 20 years. And I wouldn't attempt that journey in a November blizzard. Too many ways to get lost, too many places where the trail disappears completely." Sarah felt desperation rising in her chest, the familiar sensation that had driven every major decision of the past 3 months. Staying at the station meant remaining visible, traceable, vulnerable to discovery by anyone Thomas might send looking for her. But attempting to reach Cedar Creek Ranch in a blizzard could be suicide, especially for someone with no experience. In mountain travel, there might be another option, the station master said, apparently recognizing her distress. "About 5 miles north of here, there's an old logging camp that's been abandoned for years. Sometimes travelers use it for shelter when they're caught between destinations. It's not comfortable, but it's better than being stranded in the open." The suggestion offered a compromise between the risk of remaining visible at the station and the danger of attempting a 30-mile journey in a blizzard. The abandoned logging camp would provide temporary shelter while keeping her location uncertain for anyone who might be tracking her movements. "Could you give me directions to this logging camp?" Sarah asked, her decision already made. Uncertainty was preferable to helplessness, and movement was always better than waiting for circumstances beyond her control. The station master's directions were detailed but sobering. The logging camp lay along a trail that followed Whitefish Creek through dense forest. The route was well marked during good weather, but snow could make landmarks difficult to recognize. If she missed the turnoff to the camp, she could find herself lost in thousands of acres of wilderness with no shelter and no way to signal for help. "Mom, I have to advise against this," the station master said as he helped her purchase basic supplies from the station's small store. "That trail can be treacherous even for experienced hikers. A woman alone, in city clothes, carrying a suitcase." "I understand the risks," Sarah replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "But I've come too far to turn back now." The supplies she purchased were minimal but essential. A heavy wool coat, sturdy boots, dried food, matches, and a small axe that the station master insisted she take. "If you do reach the logging camp," he explained, "you'll need to build fires to stay warm. And if you get lost—" He left the sentence unfinished, but Sarah understood. The axe might be her only tool for creating shelter or signaling for rescue. As she set out from Whitefish Station with snow falling steadily around her, Sarah reflected on the series of desperate choices that had brought her to this moment. 3 months ago, she had been Sarah Caldwell, living a life of comfortable deception in Philadelphia, pretending not to notice her husband's criminal activities in exchange for financial security and social respectability. The discovery of Thomas's hidden operations had forced her to choose between complicity and escape. Escape had led to the decision to assume a false identity and travel west as a mail-order bride. James Harrison's failure to meet her at the station had forced another choice: wait visibly for his arrival or disappear into the Montana wilderness. Each decision had narrowed her options while increasing the stakes. Now she was Sarah Mitchell, a woman who existed only on forged papers, walking alone into a blizzard towards shelter that might not exist, carrying supplies that might not be sufficient, pursuing a new life that might prove as dangerous as the one she'd fled. The trail along Whitefish Creek was clearly marked at first, with blazes cut into tree trunks and occasional signs pointing toward various destinations. But as snow continued to fall and daylight faded, the markers became harder to spot. Sarah found herself stopping frequently to search for the next blaze, sometimes backtracking when she realized she'd lost the trail entirely. The physical demands of mountain hiking in winter weather quickly exhausted her city-softened muscles. The heavy coat and boots she'd purchased were warmer than her traveling clothes, but they made every step more difficult. Her leather suitcase, which had seemed practical for train travel, became an unwieldy burden that caught on branches and threw off her balance on uneven ground. By the time she'd been walking for 2 hours, Sarah was beginning to understand why the station master had advised against the journey. The trail was disappearing under accumulating snow, and the forest around her looked increasingly unfamiliar. Worst of all, her intended destination remained invisible somewhere ahead in the swirling darkness. The sound that made her stop walking entirely came from somewhere off the trail to her left. A sound that didn't belong in the natural symphony of wind through pine branches and snow settling on frozen ground. It sounded almost like voices, human voices, but so faint and distant that Sarah couldn't be certain she wasn't imagining them. She stood perfectly still, listening intently, but heard only the storm. Then it came again. Definitely voices. Definitely. Human, calling out in what sounded like distress or panic. The voices seemed to be coming from a direction that led away from the trail toward deeper forest, exactly the kind of detour that could get her hopelessly lost. Every survival instinct told Sarah to ignore the voices and continue searching for the logging camp. Getting involved with other people's problems would delay her arrival at shelter, increase her exposure to the storm, and potentially compromise the anonymity she desperately needed to maintain. But as she stood there in the falling snow, listening to those distant voices grow fainter, Sarah realized that survival instincts weren't the only forces shaping her decisions. The same desperation that had driven her across a continent was now demanding that she investigate sounds that might indicate people in trouble. Because, if there were people lost in these mountains tonight, they were facing the same life-threatening situation she was confronting. The decision to leave the trail felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. But Sarah Mitchell, who had already stepped off several metaphorical cliffs in the past 3 months, adjusted her grip on her suitcase and began fighting her way through deepening snow toward voices that might be calling for the kind of help she was uniquely qualified to provide. After all, she had become an expert in desperation. Perhaps that expertise could serve someone else's survival as well as her own. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The voices led Sarah deeper into the forest than any rational person should have ventured during a blizzard. Each step away from the marked trail increased her chances of becoming permanently lost, but the sounds of distress grew clearer as she pushed through snow-laden pine branches that scraped against her coat and caught at her suitcase. What she had initially thought might be adult travelers in trouble gradually revealed itself as something far more heartbreaking. The voices calling through the storm belonged to children, young children, their words barely audible above the wind, but unmistakably desperate. "Help us! Please, somebody help us!" The clearest voice sounded like a girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old, with the kind of authority that suggested she was trying to keep other children calm while fighting her own terror. Sarah abandoned any pretense of caution and began running toward the voices, her city boots slipping on hidden rocks and her suitcase bouncing against her legs. The forest floor rose steeply as she climbed what appeared to be a natural ridge, following the sound of children's cries that seemed to come from just ahead, always just ahead, like voices in a fever dream. When she finally found them, the reality was worse than anything her imagination had conjured during the desperate search. What she discovered wasn't children lost in the storm, but children buried in it. The site appeared to have once been some kind of shelter, perhaps a hunting cabin that had collapsed under the weight of previous storms. Scattered timbers and broken foundation stones created a natural depression that had filled with snow over what must have been days or weeks. But the snow wasn't empty. It was moving. Small hands emerged from the white surface, like flowers pushing through soil. Arms waved frantically above the snow line. Most terrifying of all, faces appeared and disappeared as children struggled to keep their heads above the accumulating drifts that threatened to bury them completely. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, dropping her suitcase and falling to her knees beside the nearest struggling child. "How many of you are there? How long have you been here?" 15. The girl's voice Sarah had been following belonged to a child whose dark hair was matted with ice and whose lips were blue with cold, but whose eyes burned with fierce determination. "We've been here 3 days. The snow keeps getting deeper." Sarah's mind reeled as she tried to process the scope of the emergency. 15 children buried in snow, surviving for 3 days in conditions that would have killed most adults within hours. The logistics of rescue seemed impossible for one person, but the alternative was unthinkable. "I'm going to get you out," Sarah said, though she had no idea how she would accomplish such a promise. "All of you. But I need to understand what happened. Here." The girl who seemed to be the group's unofficial leader was named Emma Patterson, and her story emerged in fragments as Sarah began the desperate work of digging children out of snow that had frozen solid around their bodies. Emma and her 14 companions weren't random children who had gotten lost during the storm. They were escapees from something called the Riverside Industrial School, a state institution located 40 miles east of Whitefish. According to Emma, the school was actually a place where unwanted children were sent to work in conditions that made adult factories look humane. "They make us work 18 hours a day," Emma explained, as Sarah used her hands to scrape snow away from a smaller child whose lips had gone grey with cold. "Processing lumber, cleaning machinery, sorting materials. If you get sick, they lock you in the cellar until you die or get better. If you complain, they take away your food for days." The children's escape had been planned for months, coordinated by Emma and 2 boys named Michael Chen and David Rodriguez, who had been at Riverside longer than most, and understood the patterns of guard rotations and security measures. They had waited for the first major snowstorm of winter, knowing that the harsh weather would make immediate pursuit difficult. "We thought we could reach the railroad," Emma continued as Sarah moved. "To another buried child, this one so small he couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Follow the tracks to a town where someone would help us. But we got lost in the dark, and then the snow got too deep to walk through." The collapsed shelter they had found had seemed like salvation at first. The broken timbers provided some protection from wind, and the depression created by the ruined foundation offered shelter from the worst of the storm. But as snow continued to fall over 3 days, what had initially been refuge became a trap that threatened to bury them alive. "We tried to dig out yesterday," explained one of the older boys, Michael Chen, whose steady voice belied the terror in his eyes. "But every time we clear an area, more snow fills it in, and we're getting weaker. Some of the little ones stopped talking this morning." Sarah looked around at the scene with growing horror. Several of the smallest children had indeed stopped moving entirely, their bodies so deeply buried that only their faces remained visible above the snowline. Without immediate intervention, she was looking at multiple deaths from exposure and hypothermia. The tools at her disposal were pathetically inadequate for the task ahead. Her small axe could break through crusted snow, but using it around buried children risked injury. Her hands, already numb from cold, would have to do most of the work. Most critically, she had no way to transport 15 children to safety through a blizzard that showed no signs of abating. But Sarah had learned something important about herself during the past 3 months of running from Thomas Caldwell. Desperate situations revealed capabilities she had never known she possessed. The same resourcefulness that had enabled her to forge identity papers, plan a cross-country escape, and survive alone in an unfamiliar city would have to serve her now. "Listen to me," she said, addressing the group of children with as much authority as she could project while kneeling in snow up to her waist. "I'm going to get every one of you out of this snow, but we have to work together. The older ones need to help with the younger ones. Everyone who can move needs to keep moving. We're going to survive this, but only if we don't give up." The rescue process that followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever imagined she might be capable of. Using her axe to break through the hardest packed snow and her hands to carefully excavate around small bodies, she worked her way methodically through the buried group. Each child presented different challenges. Some had been buried so long that their clothes had frozen to the snow around them, requiring careful work to free them without tearing fabric that provided their only insulation. Others had lost feeling in their extremities and couldn't assist in their own rescue. The smallest children were barely conscious, their bodies shutting down from prolonged exposure. As Sarah worked, she began to understand the remarkable survival strategy the children had developed. They had created a network of connected tunnels and air pockets beneath the snow, sharing body heat and taking turns breathing through small holes they kept clear with constant vigilance. The older children had systematically shared food and water, ensuring that the youngest received priority even as their own strength failed. "Emma organized everything," explained David Rodriguez, a 13-year-old whose leadership abilities had clearly been crucial to the group's survival. She made sure everyone had a buddy to watch for signs of freezing. She rationed our food and water. She kept us taking turns singing songs so we wouldn't fall asleep and freeze to death. Emma Patterson's leadership under impossible circumstances filled Sarah with admiration, mixed with rage. This girl possessed organizational abilities and moral courage that many adults never developed, yet she had been condemned to industrial servitude by a system that treated unwanted children as disposable labor. The story that emerged as Sarah continued her rescue efforts painted a picture of institutional abuse that made Thomas Caldwell's criminal activities look almost benign by comparison. Riverside Industrial School had been established as a solution to the problem of orphaned and abandoned children in Montana Territory, but had evolved into something closer to a slave labor operation. Children as young as 5 were forced to work, dangerous jobs processing timber and operating machinery. Those who couldn't keep up were beaten or starved until they either improved their performance or died. Escape attempts were punished with solitary confinement in unheated cellars where children frequently died of exposure or disease. "My little brother tried to run away last year," whispered one of the younger girls as Sarah carefully freed her from a snow pocket that had nearly become her grave. "They caught him and put him in the punishment cellar. He never came out. They said he died of pneumonia, but—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood. The systematic cruelty described by the children triggered something deep and fierce in Sarah's chest. Her own experience with Thomas had taught her about powerlessness, about living in fear of violence from someone stronger and more ruthless. But Thomas had only threatened one person. The administrators of Riverside Industrial School were threatening 15 children whose only crime had been existing without families to protect them. By the time Sarah had excavated all 15 children from their snow graves, night had fallen completely, and the storm had intensified. The rescued children huddled together in the slight shelter provided by the collapsed cabin ruins, but their situation remained desperately precarious. Several of the youngest showed signs of advanced hypothermia. All were soaked through with melted snow and had no dry clothing to change into. Most critically, Sarah realized that the abandoned logging camp she had been seeking might not exist, or might be impossible to find in current conditions. Even if she could locate it, moving 15 weakened children through deep snow in a blizzard could prove as dangerous as leaving them where they were. "We need shelter and heat," Sarah announced, surveying the available resources. "Real shelter, not just protection from wind. And we need it here, because we're not going anywhere in this storm." The solution that emerged combined Sarah's desperate resourcefulness with the children's hard-won knowledge of survival. Using her axe and salvageable timbers from the collapsed cabin, they began constructing what amounted to a snow cave reinforced with wood. The technique involved digging into the accumulated snowdrifts to create a hollow space, then lining that space with broken boards and timbers to prevent collapse. The children's small size became an advantage, allowing them to work in tight spaces that would have been impossible for adults to navigate. Sarah had never built a snow shelter before, but Emma Patterson and several of the older children had learned survival techniques during previous escape attempts. Their combined knowledge filled gaps in Sarah's understanding of how to create insulation, maintain air circulation, and prevent deadly carbon monoxide buildup from fires in enclosed spaces. "The secret is making the shelter just big enough," Emma explained, as they worked together to arrange salvaged boards into a framework. "Too big, and you can't heat it. Too small, and you don't have room to move around and stay warm." The construction took hours of exhausting work in conditions that grew more dangerous with each passing minute. Sarah's hands had long since lost all feeling, and several of the children were showing signs of confusion that indicated hypothermia was advancing toward life-threatening stages. But gradually, their desperate improvisation began to create something that resembled actual shelter. A cave-like space, large enough for all 16 of them, reinforced with salvaged lumber, insulated with pine boughs the older children had gathered, and featuring a small fire pit constructed from foundation stones. The first fire Sarah managed to build inside their improvised shelter represented more than warmth. It represented the possibility of survival through the night, and beyond that, the possibility of figuring out what to do with 15 children who couldn't return to the institution they had risked death to escape. As the children pressed close to the tiny fire, steam rising from their wet clothes and color slowly returning to blue-tinged faces, Sarah found herself studying each face in the flickering light. 15 individual children, ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 14, each with their own story of abandonment or loss that had led them to Riverside Industrial School. There was Emma Patterson, the natural leader whose determination had kept the group alive. Michael Chen and David Rodriguez, whose planning abilities had made the escape possible. A pair of sisters named Lucy and Margaret Williams, who couldn't have been more than 7 and 5 years old respectively. Twin brothers named James and Joseph Murphy, whose identical faces were marked by identical expressions of wary hope. Sarah realized with growing certainty that these children had become her responsibility in ways that transcended the immediate emergency. They couldn't return to Riverside, where their escape attempt would be punished with the kind of brutality that could easily prove fatal. They had no families to claim them, no resources to support independent survival, no legal advocates to protect their interests, but they also possessed something remarkable, a functioning community built on mutual support and shared responsibility. Under Emma's leadership, and with contributions from every member according to their abilities, They had created relationships of trust and cooperation that many adult communities never achieved. As the storm continued to rage outside their improvised shelter, and the small fire struggled against drafts that threatened to extinguish their only source of heat, Sarah began to understand that rescuing these children from the snow had been the easy part. The real challenge lay ahead, figuring out how to protect 15 escaped children from institutional authorities who would inevitably come looking for them, while somehow creating the kind of life that would allow them not just to survive, but to thrive as the remarkable individuals they had already proven themselves to be. Dawn broke grey and cold over their makeshift shelter, revealing a world transformed by the night's blizzard. Snow had piled against their reinforced cave until only the smoke hole remained visible from outside, creating an insulation that had probably saved all their lives. But as Sarah carefully fed twigs to their dying fire and watched 15 children slowly wake from exhausted sleep, she faced a reality that made surviving the storm seem simple by comparison. Every one of these children was legally the property of the Montana Territory, assigned to Riverside Industrial School by court orders that treated them as assets to be managed rather than human beings with rights. Her decision to help them escape meant she was now harboring fugitives from state custody. In the eyes of the law, Sarah Mitchell had become a kidnapper. The irony wasn't lost on her. 3 months ago, she had been Sarah Caldwell, fleeing Philadelphia to escape a criminal husband. Now she was Sarah Mitchell, about to become a criminal herself by protecting children from a system that treated them as slave labor. The cycle of running from authority seemed destined to define her entire life. "Miss Sarah," Emma Patterson's voice interrupted her brooding. The girl was already awake and alert, despite having slept on frozen ground with only pine boughs for bedding. What happens to us now? The question Sarah had been dreading hung in the smoke-filled air of their shelter. She looked around at 14 other faces, some still swollen with sleep, others already showing the wary alertness of children who had learned that adults often brought disappointment or danger. "I don't know yet," Sarah answered honestly. "But I promise you won't go back to that place. Whatever we have to do, wherever we have to go, you won't go back there." The promise left her mouth before her rational mind could intervene. Sarah had no legal authority over these children, no resources to support them, no plan for keeping them safe from institutional authorities who would certainly search for escaped state wards. Yet something deeper than rational calculation had made the commitment on their behalf. Michael Chen, one of the older boys whose planning had enabled their escape, studied Sarah's face with the kind of adult skepticism that shouldn't have existed in a 13-year-old. "Adults always promise things they can't deliver," he said quietly. "How do we know you're different?" The challenge was fair and devastating. Sarah realized she was asking these children to trust her based on nothing more than her word. Exactly. The kind of false hope that had probably been used to manipulate them throughout their short lives. "You don't know I'm different," Sarah replied, "but you know what happens if you go back to Riverside, and you know you can't survive in this wilderness on your own. So the question isn't whether you can trust me completely. The question is whether you're willing to take a chance on something that might be better than what you're running from." Emma exchanged glances with Michael and David Rodriguez, the 3 leaders engaging in silent communication that spoke to their experience making life or death decisions together. Finally, Emma nodded. "We'll try it your way," she said. "But if you betray us, if you try to send us back or turn us over to authorities, we'll run again. And next time, we'll be better prepared." The negotiation felt surreal. Sarah was bargaining with children as if they were equal partners in planning their mutual future. But these weren't ordinary children. They were survivors who had organized a complex escape, maintained group discipline under impossible conditions, and developed leadership structures that many adult organizations would envy. Fair enough, Sarah agreed. But first, we need to get out of this forest and find real shelter, and I need to understand exactly what kind of legal situation we're dealing with. As they prepared to leave their snow cave, Sarah inventoried their resources and challenges. The positive: 15 children who had proven capable of remarkable cooperation and survival, her own determination to protect them at any cost. Enough basic supplies to keep everyone alive for a few more days. The negative: no legal right to custody of any child, no permanent shelter, no reliable source of food or income, no clear destination where they could remain hidden from authorities indefinitely. And most critically, no understanding of how extensive the search for escaped state wards might become. The hiking that followed their emergence from the shelter tested everyone's endurance, but confirmed something important about the children's capabilities. Despite their ordeal, despite inadequate clothing and empty stomachs, they organized themselves into an efficient traveling formation without adult direction. Emma and the older boys took turns breaking trail through deep snow. The middle-aged children partnered with younger ones, sharing warmth and taking turns carrying those too small to keep up. Even the youngest contributed by watching for landmarks and hazards that the trail breakers might miss. Sarah found herself learning from their organizational methods rather than directing them. These children had developed survival skills through necessity that surpassed her own improvised wilderness knowledge. There, David Rodriguez pointed through bare aspen trees toward a structure that materialized through falling snow like a mirage. That's got to be the logging camp the station man told you about. The abandoned logging camp exceeded Sarah's modest expectations. 3 substantial log buildings surrounded a central clearing, their roofs partially collapsed, but walls still solid enough to provide windproof shelter. A creek ran nearby, visible as a dark line through the snow. Most importantly, the site was isolated enough that they could establish temporary residence without immediate detection. The largest building had obviously served as a communal bunkhouse, its interior featuring multiple sleeping alcoves and a massive stone fireplace that dominated one wall. The second building contained what appeared to have been kitchen and dining facilities. The third, smallest building showed signs of having housed equipment and supplies. This could work, Emma said, surveying the main building with the practical eye of someone accustomed to making the best of inadequate conditions. We can make it weatherproof with some work. The fireplace will heat the whole space if we can find enough wood. Over the following hours, Sarah watched in amazement as the children transformed the abandoned logging camp into functional shelter. Working in teams organized by age and capability, they swept out debris, repaired gaps in walls using salvaged materials, and established systems for water collection, waste disposal, and food preparation. Their efficiency spoke to hard-won experience, making abandoned spaces habitable, but it also revealed something more fundamental about their characters. These weren't children waiting for adults to solve their problems. They were capable individuals who saw obstacles as puzzles to solve rather than insurmountable barriers. By evening, they had created something approaching comfortable accommodations. The main building was warm, dry, and organized into sleeping areas that provided privacy while maintaining group security. A cooking fire burned safely in the stone fireplace, and hot soup made from Sarah's dried supplies filled the space with aromas that represented comfort and hope. But as Sarah looked around at 15 children who had created a temporary home through their own efforts, she faced the question that had been growing more urgent throughout the day. What happened next? "We can't stay here permanently," she announced during their evening meal. "Eventually someone will find this place, and even if they don't, we don't have enough supplies to last more than a few days. So, "What are you suggesting?" Michael Chen asked, his tone carrying the wariness of someone who had learned to distrust adult plans that affected children's lives. Sarah had been considering possibilities throughout the afternoon, weighing options that all involved significant risks. The choice she was contemplating would fundamentally alter her own life trajectory while potentially providing the children with something they had never experienced: genuine security. "There's a man named James Harrison who owns a cattle ranch about 30 miles from here," Sarah began slowly. "He's expecting to marry me. He doesn't know anything about my real situation or about finding you, but his letters suggest he's a decent person who values independence and privacy." Emma's eyes narrowed. "You're thinking about showing up at his ranch with 15 extra children and hoping he'll just accept us?" "I'm thinking about showing up and telling him the truth," Sarah replied. "About who I am, why I came here, what happened to you, and what kind of help we need. It's a gamble, but it might be our best chance." The plan she outlined was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its dependence on the character of a man she had never met. James Harrison had written letters suggesting he was kind, principled, and committed to building something meaningful on his Montana ranch. If those letters reflected his true character, he might be willing to help 15 children who had nowhere else to turn. But if James Harrison proved less generous than his correspondence suggested, Sarah would be delivering herself and 15 vulnerable children directly to someone who could easily turn them over to authorities. "There's another possibility," David Rodriguez said quietly. "We could just disappear, split up into smaller groups, head for different territories where they don't know about escaped children from Montana institutions." The suggestion had merit. Smaller groups would be harder to track and easier to hide. Some of the older children might successfully integrate into frontier communities, where extra hands were always needed, and questions about backgrounds were rarely asked. But Sarah recognized the fundamental flaw in the dispersal strategy. These children had survived by supporting each other. The community bonds that had kept them alive through their escape and rescue would be broken forever if they scattered. Each child would face the future alone, without the network of relationships that represented their greatest strength. "No," Emma said firmly, apparently reaching the same conclusion. "We stay together, all of us. If Miss Sarah thinks this rancher might help us, then we try that first." The decision to approach James Harrison's ranch as a group represented a choice between safety and unity, between maximizing individual survival chances and maintaining the community relationships that had brought them this far. Looking around, at faces illuminated by firelight, Sarah realized that the choice had already been made before conscious deliberation began. These children had become a family, forged by shared hardship and mutual dependence. Breaking that family apart would constitute another form of abuse, different from, but perhaps as damaging as the institutional cruelty they had escaped. "Tomorrow we head for Cedar Creek Ranch," Sarah announced. "All of us, together." As the children settled into their sleeping areas and the fire died down to glowing embers, Sarah lay awake, considering the magnitude of what she was attempting. In the space of 24 hours, she had transformed from a woman fleeing her own problems into someone accepting responsibility for 15 lives. The transformation felt both terrifying and inevitable. Perhaps this was what she had been running toward, rather than away from. Perhaps the desperation that had driven her across a continent had been preparing her for exactly this moment, when running toward something became more important than running from something else. Outside their shelter, wind continued to move through the abandoned logging camp, carrying the promise of more snow and harder challenges ahead. But inside, 15 children slept safely for the first time in months, protected by someone who had chosen their welfare over her own security. Tomorrow would test whether good intentions could survive contact with reality, whether James Harrison would prove as generous as his letters suggested, and whether a mail-order bride could become the guardian angel these children desperately needed. But tonight, they were warm, fed, and safe. For children who had learned to measure hope in hours rather than days, that was enough. The journey to Cedar Creek Ranch took 2 days through mountain terrain that tested everyone's endurance and Sarah's growing understanding of what it meant to be responsible for 15 lives. What should have been a straightforward 30-mile trek became an exercise in crisis management as weather, terrain, and the children's varying physical capabilities created obstacles that demanded constant adaptation. The first crisis came within hours of leaving the logging camp. Lucy Williams, one of the youngest at only 5 years old, developed a fever that left her barely able to walk. Her sister Margaret, just 7 herself, refused to leave Lucy's side, which meant the entire group's pace slowed to accommodate 2 struggling children. "We could make a travois," suggested James Murphy, one of the older twins whose practical mind often found solutions others missed. "Drag her on branches between 2 people." The improvised stretcher they constructed from pine poles and Sarah's spare clothing worked, but required 4 children to take turns pulling while others broke trail through snow that remained knee-deep, even on established paths. The physical demands pushed everyone to their limits, but revealed something remarkable about their group dynamics. Without adult direction, the children had organized themselves into an efficient support system. The strongest took turns pulling Lucy's travois. Others shared the burden of carrying supplies. Emma Patterson and Michael Chen ranged ahead to scout the trail, while David Rodriguez brought up the rear to ensure no one fell behind. Most impressively, they had established a rotation system that kept everyone engaged and prevented any individual from becoming overwhelmed by responsibility. Sarah found herself following their lead rather than directing their efforts, learning organizational methods that seemed to emerge from collective wisdom rather than hierarchical command. The second crisis revealed the complexity of their legal situation. Late on the first day, they encountered another traveler on the trail, a U.S. Marshal named William Thompson, who was heading toward Whitefish on official business. Thompson was a weathered man in his 50s, whose keen eyes immediately took in the unusual sight of a woman traveling with 15 children through mountain wilderness. His questions were polite but persistent, clearly driven by professional suspicion about circumstances that didn't match normal travel patterns. "That's quite a group you've got there, ma'am," Thompson observed, his hand resting casually on his gun belt in a gesture Sarah recognized as practiced readiness. "Heading to family in the area." Sarah felt her pulse accelerate as she realized this moment could determine whether their journey continued or ended with all 16 of them in custody. Her response needed to satisfy Thompson's curiosity without providing information that could lead to their capture. "We're joining my husband at his ranch," Sarah replied, hoping her voice carried more confidence than she felt. "The children are relatives who've been staying with me during difficult family circumstances." The explanation was technically truthful, while omitting crucial details about the nature of those family circumstances. Thompson studied the children with the trained eye of someone accustomed to recognizing lies and evasions. 15 relatives, Thompson repeated slowly. Must be some large family. Emma Patterson stepped forward with the kind of composed dignity that Sarah was learning to expect from the remarkable girl. "Our parents died in a typhoid outbreak back east," Emma said, meeting Thompson's gaze directly. "Miss Sarah is taking us to live with her husband's family on their ranch." The story was plausible enough to explain their circumstances without inviting deeper investigation. More importantly, Emma's delivery was so natural and confident that Thompson's suspicious expression began to soften. "Typhoid's terrible business," Thompson said, his professional wariness giving way to human sympathy. "Sorry for your losses, children. You're fortunate to have family willing to take you in." Michael Chen nodded gravely. "Miss Sarah saved us when we had nowhere else to go." The comment was loaded with double meaning that Thompson couldn't possibly understand, but it reinforced the narrative of Sarah as a rescuer rather than a kidnapper. Thompson's questions continued for several more minutes, but the children's consistent and believable responses gradually satisfied his curiosity. After Thompson departed, continuing toward Whitefish with official business that might or might not include searching for escaped state wards, Sarah realized how narrowly they had avoided disaster. But she also understood something important about the children's capabilities under pressure. "Where did that story come from?" Sarah asked Emma as they resumed their journey. "It's close enough to true that we could remember it," Emma replied with pragmatic wisdom. "And it explains why we're all together without making anyone suspicious, about why adults would have so many children who aren't related." The strategic thinking behind their deception impressed Sarah almost as much as their ability to execute it under pressure. These children had learned to navigate dangerous adult authority through careful truth-telling that revealed nothing while satisfying curiosity. By the second day of travel, Lucy Williams had recovered enough to walk short distances, but the group's pace remained slower than Sarah had hoped. More concerning, they were consuming supplies faster than anticipated. If James Harrison proved unwilling to help them, they would face starvation within days. The approach to Cedar Creek Ranch revealed why James Harrison had chosen this location for his operation. The valley opened into a natural amphitheater surrounded by protective ridges, with grasslands that would support cattle and a creek that provided reliable water. The ranch building sat on a slight rise that offered commanding views of approaches from all directions. 3 structures dominated the complex: a substantial log house with a wide front porch, a large barn that could shelter livestock and equipment, and a smaller building that appeared to serve as a bunkhouse for seasonal workers. Smoke rose from the main house's chimney, and cattle moved across distant pastures like dark spots against the snow. "It's beautiful," whispered Margaret Williams, the 7-year-old whose fever had broken during their second night of travel. "It looks like the kind of place where people could be happy." Sarah hoped Margaret's assessment proved accurate because their future depended entirely on the character of the man who had built this isolated empire in the Montana wilderness. James Harrison emerged from his house as their unusual procession approached his front gate. At 42, he was exactly as his letters had described: tall, lean, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of steady bearing that came from years of managing complex operations in challenging conditions. His expression as he took in the sight of 16 travelers instead of the single mail-order bride he had been expecting progressed through confusion, concern, and finally a kind of resigned curiosity that suggested he was accustomed to unexpected developments. "Sarah Mitchell, I presume," Harrison said, his voice carrying the slight formality of someone choosing his words carefully. "Though I confess your traveling companions weren't mentioned in your letters." The moment of truth had arrived. Sarah could attempt to maintain the deception that had brought her here, spinning elaborate lies about unexpected family obligations and temporary arrangements. Or she could trust that the character revealed in James Harrison's letters reflected his true nature. "My name isn't Sarah Mitchell," she began, her voice steadying as she committed to honesty, "and these children aren't my relatives. But we're all in desperate need of help, and I'm hoping you're the kind of man who might be willing to listen to our story." Harrison's reaction surprised her. Instead of anger at the deception or suspicion about her motives, his expression showed what appeared to be relief. "I wondered what kind of woman would agree to marry a stranger and move to the middle of nowhere," he said, with unexpected humor. "The real story is probably more interesting than anything I imagined." Over the next hour, Sarah told James Harrison everything. Her real identity as Sarah Caldwell, fleeing an abusive criminal husband in Philadelphia. The children's escape from institutional abuse at Riverside Industrial School. The blizzard rescue that had made her responsible for 15 lives. The impossible legal and practical challenges they faced. Harrison listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious as the scope of their situation became clear. When Sarah finished, he was quiet for several minutes, studying the faces of children who waited to learn whether they had found sanctuary or simply encountered another adult who would betray their trust. 15 children, Harrison said finally. All of them fugitives from state custody, and you, a woman with forged papers and a criminal husband probably looking for her. He shook his head slowly. "I was expecting a quiet marriage to a nice woman from back east." Sarah felt her heart sink as she recognized what sounded like rejection, disguised as reasonable self-interest. She had gambled everything on James Harrison's character and appeared to have lost. "But," Harrison continued, his tone shifting in a direction Sarah hadn't expected, "I've seen what passes for child welfare in Montana Territory, and I've got more land, more resources, and more space than one man needs." He looked directly at Emma Patterson. "The question is whether you children are prepared for the kind of work it takes to make a ranch operation successful." Emma's response was immediate and confident. "We know how to work, Mr. Harrison. We know how to work together. And we know the difference between fair work and exploitation." "Fair enough," Harrison replied. "Then let's talk about what kind of arrangement might work for everyone." The negotiation that followed revealed James Harrison to be a man whose practical wisdom matched his generous instincts. Rather than simply offering charity, he proposed a partnership that would benefit everyone involved while addressing the legal and financial challenges they faced. The children could remain at Cedar Creek Ranch as his wards, protected by his legal status as their guardian, but contributing to the ranch operation according to their abilities. Sarah could formalize their mail-order marriage arrangement, providing her with legal protection from Thomas Caldwell, while giving Harrison the partnership he had originally sought. Most importantly, Harrison's isolated ranch offered the kind of sanctuary where 15 children could grow up safely while learning skills that would serve them throughout their lives. The community they had formed through shared hardship could continue developing in an environment that rewarded cooperation and mutual support. "There's one condition," Harrison added as their discussion concluded. "Everyone contributes according to their abilities, and everyone shares in the benefits of what we build together. This isn't charity, it's partnership." Emma Patterson extended her small hand to shake James Harrison's much larger one. "Mr. Harrison," she said with the dignity of someone twice her age, "I think we're going to like it here." As the sun set over Cedar Creek Ranch and 15 children explored what might become their permanent home, Sarah realized that her journey toward guardian angel status was complete. She had transformed from a woman fleeing her problems into someone who had found her purpose in protecting others who couldn't protect themselves. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they began the complex work of building a life together. But tonight, for the first time since leaving Philadelphia, Sarah felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The first month at Cedar Creek Ranch tested everyone's capacity for adaptation in ways that none of them had anticipated. What had seemed like a fairy tale resolution to their desperate circumstances quickly revealed itself as the beginning of the most challenging phase of their journey together. James Harrison had been generous in offering sanctuary, but his ranch operation was struggling financially in ways he hadn't fully disclosed during their initial negotiations. The cattle market had collapsed following a severe drought the previous summer, and Harrison was carrying debts that threatened his ability to maintain the property through another difficult year. Sarah discovered the true extent of their host's financial troubles when she volunteered to help with the ranch bookkeeping, a skill she had developed while managing her late father's small business in Philadelphia. The ledgers told a sobering story of mounting expenses, declining income, and creditors who were growing impatient with delayed payments. "I should have been more honest about my situation," Harrison admitted during a private conversation in his study 3 weeks after their arrival. "Truth is, I've been barely keeping this place afloat for 2 years. Taking on 16 more mouths to feed might have been generous, but it wasn't particularly practical." The revelation forced Sarah to confront an uncomfortable reality. Rather than finding sanctuary at Cedar Creek Ranch, they had simply transferred their dependence from institutional authorities to a man whose own future remained uncertain. If Harrison lost his ranch to creditors, 16 people would once again find themselves homeless and vulnerable. But the financial pressures also created an opportunity that Sarah was uniquely positioned to recognize. During her 3-year marriage to Thomas Caldwell, she had learned about business operations through necessity. Managing a household budget while her husband invested in criminal enterprises had taught her about cash flow, resource allocation, and the kind of creative problem-solving that desperate circumstances demanded. What if 15 children weren't additional mouths to feed, but additional workers to generate income? Sarah proposed during their discussion of the ranch's financial challenges. What if we could find ways to make the ranch more profitable rather than less? Harrison's initial skepticism was understandable. Children, even capable children like the refugees from Riverside Industrial School, weren't typically considered economic assets in ranch operations. But Sarah had observed something during their journey that Harrison hadn't yet recognized. These children possessed organizational and leadership capabilities that most adults never developed. The plan Sarah outlined over the following days was ambitious in scope and radical in its approach to child welfare. Rather than treating the children as dependents to be sheltered, she proposed integrating them as full partners in a diversified ranch operation that could generate income through multiple revenue streams. Emma Patterson and the older children could manage an expanded vegetable garden that would supply not only ranch needs, but produce for sale in nearby towns. Michael Chen and David Rodriguez could coordinate livestock management systems that would improve breeding success and reduce losses to predators or disease. Even the youngest children could contribute through activities like egg collection, butter churning, and cheese making that could generate products for local sale. Most importantly, the children's demonstrated abilities in organization and cooperation could be applied to streamline ranch operations in ways that reduced costs while improving efficiency. Their experience surviving together had taught them resource conservation techniques that could benefit the entire operation. Harrison's response to Sarah's proposal was cautious but intrigued. "You're talking about turning this ranch into some kind of communal operation where children work as partners rather than dependents." "I'm talking about recognizing what these children actually are," Sarah replied. "They're not helpless orphans waiting for adults to solve their problems. They're capable individuals who have already proven they can work together to achieve remarkable things." The implementation of their expanded ranch operation began with a comprehensive assessment of available resources and untapped opportunities. Working together, Sarah and the children catalogued everything from available land and water sources to existing equipment and potential markets for agricultural products. The process revealed possibilities that Harrison had never considered. Creekside land that he had dismissed as unsuitable for cattle could support intensive vegetable cultivation. Outbuildings that had been used only for storage could be converted into workshops for producing goods that commanded high prices in mining towns throughout the territory. Most significantly, the children's diverse backgrounds provided skills that complemented ranch operations in unexpected ways. Several had learned carpentry while imprisoned at Riverside Industrial School. Others possessed knowledge of textile production, food preservation, and mechanical repair that could either save money on outside services or generate income through services provided to neighbors. Within 6 weeks of implementing their plan, Cedar Creek Ranch had been transformed from a struggling cattle operation into a diversified enterprise that generated income from multiple sources. The children's vegetable garden produced surplus crops that sold quickly in Whitefish and surrounding communities. Their workshop operations created furniture and tools that commanded premium prices from customers who valued quality craftsmanship. But the most significant change was in the ranch's atmosphere and culture. What had been a lonely bachelor's operation, managed by one overworked man, became a thriving community, where 15 capable individuals contributed according to their abilities while sharing in the benefits of collective success. The transformation wasn't accomplished without challenges that tested everyone's commitment to their new arrangements. The first serious crisis came when Margaret Williams, the 7-year-old whose fever had nearly derailed their journey to the ranch, was severely injured while helping with livestock feeding. The accident occurred when Margaret attempted to climb into the cattle pen to retrieve a fallen water bucket. One of Harrison's bulls, startled by her sudden movement, knocked her against the fence with enough force to break her left arm and leave her unconscious for several minutes. Sarah's response to the emergency revealed how completely her priorities had shifted since arriving at Cedar Creek Ranch. Rather than viewing Margaret's injury as evidence that children shouldn't be involved in ranch work, Sarah organized a comprehensive safety review that identified and addressed potential hazards throughout the operation. Working with Emma Patterson and the older children, Sarah developed safety protocols that were more thorough than those typically used in adult-only ranch operations. Every work assignment was evaluated for age-appropriate participation. Safety equipment was improvised or purchased to protect workers who were smaller and less experienced than typical ranch hands. Most importantly, the accident became an opportunity to reinforce the community principle that everyone's welfare was everyone's responsibility. While Margaret recovered from her injuries, other children absorbed her usual tasks without complaint. When she was able to return to work, modified assignments kept her productive while protecting her from activities that might aggravate her healing arm. The incident also strengthened Sarah's relationship with James Harrison by demonstrating her commitment to protecting the children while maintaining their productive role in ranch operations. Harrison had been prepared for Sarah to withdraw the children from potentially dangerous work after Margaret's accident. Instead, she had organized improvements that made everyone safer while preserving their economic contributions. You've thought about this more carefully than most parents think about their own children's safety, Harrison observed while reviewing the new safety protocols. These kids are fortunate to have someone who takes their welfare so seriously. The comment touched something deep in Sarah's understanding of her own transformation. 3 months earlier, she had been focused entirely on her own survival, fleeing Thomas Caldwell's violence with no thought beyond reaching safety. Now she found herself making decisions based on the welfare of 15 other people, accepting responsibility for their safety, education, and future prospects. The change felt both dramatic and natural, as if protecting these children had awakened capabilities she had always possessed but never had occasion to use. Perhaps mothering instincts weren't limited to biological relationships. Perhaps the capacity to nurture and guide could be activated by proximity to need rather than genetic connection. Winter's arrival brought new challenges that tested the community bonds they had been building. December, blizzards isolated Cedar Creek Ranch for weeks at a time, forcing 16 people to live in close quarters with limited outside stimulation. Cabin fever became a real concern as tempers grew short, and minor disagreements escalated into serious conflicts. The solutions Sarah developed drew on lessons she had learned about community management during her marriage to Thomas Caldwell. Living with a man whose moods could turn violent without warning had taught her to recognize tension before it reached dangerous levels and to diffuse conflicts through strategic redirection of attention and energy. She organized the children into rotating work teams that prevented any individual from spending too much time with people who irritated them. She established quiet spaces where anyone could retreat when they needed solitude. Most importantly, she instituted regular community meetings where grievances could be aired and resolved through group discussion rather than festering into lasting resentments. The community meetings became a forum for democratic decision-making that impressed James Harrison with their sophistication and effectiveness. Children who had been treated as property by institutional authorities demonstrated remarkable maturity in addressing conflicts and making collective decisions about ranch operations. "You've created something I've never seen before," Harrison told Sarah during one of their private conversations. "These aren't just children living together. They're a functioning community with their own government and social structures." "They were a functioning community before I found them," Sarah replied. "They survived their escape and 3 days buried in snow because they had already learned to work together. I just helped them apply those skills to ranch life." As spring approached and their first year together neared its end, Sarah realized that Cedar Creek Ranch had become something none of them had anticipated when they first sought shelter there. It wasn't simply a place where children lived safely, under adult protection. It had evolved into a genuine partnership between adults and young people who contributed equally to their shared success. The financial results spoke to the effectiveness of their approach. Ranch income had tripled through diversification and efficient management. Debts that had threatened Harrison's ownership were being retired ahead of schedule. Most importantly, 16 people who had arrived desperate and homeless had created a sustainable life that promised security and prosperity for years to come. But the transformation went deeper than financial success. Sarah looked around the dinner table each evening at faces that had changed from gaunt desperation to healthy confidence. These children were thriving in ways that would have been impossible in conventional institutional care or traditional family arrangements. Emma Patterson had evolved from a survival leader into a ranch manager whose organizational skills surpassed those of many adults. Michael Chen and David Rodriguez had developed expertise in livestock management that made them valuable consultants to neighboring ranchers. Even the youngest children had gained confidence and capabilities that promised bright futures as they matured. Most remarkably, they had maintained the community bonds that had kept them alive during their escape, while adapting those relationships to prosperity rather than desperation. Mutual support that had once meant sharing body heat in snow caves now meant sharing knowledge, resources, and responsibilities in building something lasting and valuable. As Sarah prepared for bed in the comfortable room she now shared with James Harrison as his wife, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from Philadelphia to Montana. She had begun as Sarah Caldwell, a woman trapped in an abusive marriage with a criminal husband. She had traveled as Sarah Mitchell, a desperate refugee seeking any escape from violence and exploitation. Now she was Sarah Harrison, guardian and protector of 15 remarkable children who had taught her that family wasn't defined by blood relationships, but by willingness to sacrifice for each other's welfare. She had found her purpose not in escaping her problems, but in helping others overcome problems that were far more serious than her own. The letter arrived on a warm June morning, delivered by a territorial mail courier who seemed nervous about the contents of his satchel. Sarah recognized the official government seal before she opened the envelope, and her hands trembled as she unfolded documents that threatened to destroy everything they had built over the past 8 months. Notice of investigation. Missing state. Wards, read the header of the first document. Below it, detailed descriptions of 15 children who had escaped from Riverside Industrial School, along with rewards offered for information leading to their recovery. Sarah's stomach dropped as she realized that someone had finally connected their presence at Cedar Creek Ranch to the ongoing search for escaped institutional residents. The investigation notice was accompanied by a letter from Territorial Child Welfare Services, informing James Harrison that his ranch would be subject to inspection within 30 days. The authorities had received reports of unusual numbers of children residing at Cedar Creek, and territorial law required verification that all minors were properly documented and legally placed. James Harrison's reaction to the news was grimmer than Sarah had anticipated. "I knew this day would come eventually," he said, as they discussed the implications in his study. 15 children don't just disappear from a state institution without creating paperwork that follows them forever. The inspection notice created multiple layers of danger that would require careful coordination to address. Most obviously, the presence of 15 escaped state wards at Cedar Creek Ranch violated territorial law in ways that could result in criminal charges against both Sarah and Harrison. But the deeper threat involved the children's future welfare if they were returned to institutional custody. Emma Patterson's reaction to the news demonstrated the maturity that 8 months of ranch life had continued to develop. "We won't go back," she said simply, when Sarah explained the situation during an emergency community meeting. "Whatever it takes, whatever we have to do, we won't go back to that place." Michael Chen and David Rodriguez immediately began discussing logistics for another escape, but their planning revealed how much their circumstances had changed since their flight from Riverside Industrial School. They were no longer desperate children with nothing to lose. They had built lives at Cedar Creek Ranch, developed skills and relationships that represented genuine value. Running away would mean abandoning everything they had worked to create. "There has to be another solution," insisted Lucy Williams, now 8 years old and thriving in ways that would have been impossible under institutional care. "We belong here. This is our home." The challenge facing Sarah was unprecedented in her experience. How to protect 15 children from legal authorities while maintaining the community they had built together. Unlike her flight from Thomas Caldwell, this situation couldn't be resolved through geographic escape or identity change. The children's legal status followed them regardless of location. Sarah's solution emerged from her growing understanding of territorial politics and legal procedures. Rather than attempting to hide from the inspection or flee before authorities arrived, she proposed meeting the challenge directly through legal channels that could provide permanent protection. "We petition for legal guardianship," Sarah explained to James Harrison during their strategy session. "Not just informal custody, but official territorial recognition of our right to raise these children. If we can demonstrate that they're thriving under our care, that they're receiving appropriate education and work training, that they're contributing productively to the community, then we have grounds to argue for permanent placement." The legal strategy was ambitious and risky. Success would require demonstrating that Cedar Creek Ranch provided superior care compared to institutional alternatives. Failure would result in the immediate removal of all 15 children and possible criminal prosecution for those who had harbored escaped state wards. But Sarah's proposal had one crucial advantage. It aligned with territorial interests in reducing The costs and administrative burdens of institutional childcare. If Cedar Creek Ranch could demonstrate that private guardianship produced better outcomes at lower public expense, territorial authorities might prefer legal recognition to expensive enforcement actions. The month preceding the official inspection became the most intense period of preparation any of them had ever experienced. Every aspect of ranch operations was documented, evaluated, and improved to demonstrate the children's welfare and productivity. Sarah created detailed records showing each child's educational progress, work contributions, and personal development since arriving at Cedar Creek. The children themselves became active participants in preparing for inspection, understanding that their future depended on convincing territorial authorities that they were thriving under current arrangements. Their response revealed capabilities that impressed even Sarah, who had learned to expect remarkable things from these remarkable individuals. Emma Patterson organized a comprehensive presentation of ranch operations that highlighted each child's specific contributions and achievements. Michael Chen and David Rodriguez prepared detailed reports on livestock management and agricultural production that demonstrated economic value generated through their work. Even the youngest children practiced explaining their daily routines and educational activities in ways that would satisfy official scrutiny. The preparation process also revealed potential vulnerabilities that required strategic management. Margaret Williams still bore scars from her accident with the ranch bull, visible evidence that could be interpreted as inadequate supervision. Several of the older children had developed relationships with neighboring ranchers that could complicate questions about appropriate social development. Most concerning, Sarah's own legal status remained precarious. Her marriage to James Harrison provided some protection, but her identity as Sarah Mitchell was based on forged documents that wouldn't survive detailed investigation. If authorities discovered her true identity as Sarah Caldwell, fleeing wife of a Philadelphia criminal, it could undermine their entire case for guardianship. The solution Sarah developed required trusted allies beyond Cedar Creek Ranch. Over the past months, Harrison's increased prosperity had enabled him to build relationships with influential neighbors whose support could prove crucial during official proceedings. Sarah began cultivating those relationships systematically, explaining their situation to people whose testimonials could influence territorial decisions. The response from their neighbors surprised Sarah with its warmth and practical support. Ranchers, who had initially been skeptical about James Harrison's unusual household arrangements, had observed the children's contributions to community life and were prepared to testify on their behalf. Those children work harder and more cooperatively than most adult crews I've seen, testified Robert McKenzie, whose ranch bordered Cedar Creek to the north. Whatever arrangement Harrison and his wife have created, it's producing capable young people who contribute positively to this area. Similar endorsements came from other community members who had witnessed the children's development and contributions. The local pastor praised their regular attendance at Sunday services and their respectful behavior during community gatherings. The Whitefish station master spoke highly of their reliability and honesty during supply runs to town. Most importantly, Dr. Patricia Reynolds, the territorial physician who provided medical care throughout the region, prepared a detailed report on the children's health and development that documented improvements in nutrition, physical fitness, and psychological well-being since their arrival at Cedar Creek Ranch. The official inspection, when it finally arrived, was conducted by Territorial Child Welfare Inspector Marcus Webb, a man whose 20 years of experience investigating child placement situations had left him skeptical about unconventional arrangements. Webb arrived expecting to find evidence of exploitation, inadequate care, or inappropriate conditions that would justify removing the children from Harrison's custody. What he found instead was a functioning community where 15 children participated. as valued contributors to a successful agricultural operation while receiving education and care that exceeded standards typical of territorial institutions. Webb's initial suspicions gradually gave way to professional admiration as he observed the children's capabilities and assessed their living conditions. In 20 years of inspecting child welfare situations, I've never encountered anything like this, Webb admitted during his final interview with Sarah and James Harrison. These children aren't just adequately cared for. They're thriving in ways that most institutionalized children never achieve. The inspection process revealed aspects of the children's development that even Sarah hadn't fully recognized. Emma Patterson's leadership abilities impressed Webb as exceptional for someone her age. Michael Chen's livestock expertise equaled that of experienced ranch hands twice his age. David Rodriguez's agricultural knowledge had enabled innovations that increased ranch productivity significantly. Even more importantly, Webb observed that the children had maintained healthy relationships with each other while developing individual capabilities and interests. The community bonds that had preserved them during their escape had evolved into family relationships that provided emotional security and mutual support. The question isn't whether these children are receiving adequate care, Webb concluded. The question is whether territorial institutions could provide anything approaching the opportunities they're receiving here. Webb's official report, filed with Territorial Child Welfare Services 2 weeks after his inspection, recommended permanent legal guardianship for James and Sarah Harrison over all 15 children. His documentation emphasized the children's educational progress, economic contributions, community integration, and psychological development as evidence that Cedar Creek Ranch provided superior outcomes compared to institutional alternatives. The territorial response to Webb's recommendation revealed political complexities that Sarah hadn't anticipated. While officials acknowledged the superior care provided at Cedar Creek Ranch, they faced pressure from institutional administrators who viewed the children's successful placement as criticism of their own operations. Riverside Industrial School's director, Thomas Bradford, lobbied aggressively against allowing the escapees to remain in private custody. Bradford argued that permitting children to benefit from illegal escape attempts would encourage similar actions by other institutional residents. These children are state property, Bradford argued in his formal response to Webb's report. They were assigned to Riverside Industrial School through legal proceedings, and removing them from institutional custody based on their own illegal actions sets a dangerous precedent. The territorial hearing that would decide the children's fate was scheduled for late August, creating weeks of uncertainty during which their future remained undetermined. Sarah used this period to prepare the most comprehensive legal case she could manage, gathering testimonials, documentation, and evidence that would support their petition for permanent guardianship. The hearing itself became a confrontation between two fundamentally different philosophies of child welfare. Bradford and his institutional allies argued for the importance of maintaining legal authority and preventing children from benefiting through illegal escape. Sarah and her supporters argued for prioritizing actual child welfare over bureaucratic convenience. The children themselves were permitted to testify about their experiences and preferences, creating powerful contrasts between their descriptions of life at Riverside Industrial School and their current circumstances at Cedar Creek Ranch. Emma Patterson's composed testimony about industrial exploitation versus educational opportunity impressed territorial officials with its clarity and maturity. The decision, announced 3 days after the hearing concluded, represented complete victory for Sarah's legal strategy. Territorial Child Welfare Services granted permanent legal guardianship to James and Sarah Harrison for all 15 children, officially recognizing Cedar Creek Ranch as their legal residence and family home. But the victory also revealed threats that extended beyond territorial authorities. Thomas Bradford's final statement at the hearing included veiled references to Sarah's questionable background and suggestions that federal authorities might have interest in investigating her true identity. As Sarah celebrated the legal resolution that secured the children's future, she realized that her own past was about to create new dangers for everyone she had learned to love. Thomas Caldwell's criminal connections and violent temperament remained unresolved problems that could threaten not just her own safety, but the security of 15 children who had finally found the family they deserved. The stranger arrived at Cedar Creek Ranch on a September morning when golden leaves were beginning to drift from aspen groves and the first hints of winter touched the mountain air. Sarah spotted him from the kitchen window as she prepared breakfast for 18 people, and something about his deliberate approach to the main house made her blood run cold. He was well dressed in the manner of Eastern businessmen, riding a quality horse and carrying himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. But it was the way he studied the ranch buildings, cataloging details and assessing defenses, that triggered Sarah's deepest fears about this moment she had dreaded for over a year. "James," Sarah called to her husband, who was reviewing livestock. "Reports at the kitchen table. We have a visitor, and I don't think he's here about cattle." The man identified himself as Detective Raymond Pierce from the Philadelphia Police Department, and his credentials appeared authentic when James Harrison examined them on the front porch. Pierce was polite, professional, and absolutely certain that the woman he knew as Sarah Harrison was actually Sarah Caldwell, fugitive wife of wanted criminal Thomas Caldwell. "Mrs. Caldwell," Pierce said, his tone carrying the quiet authority of someone who had tracked down many people who thought they had successfully disappeared. "Your husband has been looking for you for quite some time. He's prepared to offer substantial compensation for information about your whereabouts." Sarah felt the familiar paralysis that had characterized her final months in Philadelphia, the helpless terror of someone trapped between an abusive husband's violence and law enforcement, that treated her as property rather than victim. But the woman who froze with fear wasn't the same person who had built a new life at Cedar Creek Ranch. 15 children depended on her strength and judgment. She couldn't afford the luxury of helplessness. "Thomas Caldwell isn't my husband anymore," Sarah replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I'm Sarah Harrison, legally married to James Harrison under Montana territorial law. Whatever claims Thomas has about my previous identity are irrelevant to my current legal status." Pierce's smile was patronizing in the manner of men who had dealt with many women attempting to escape inconvenient marriages. "Territorial marriage law doesn't supersede federal requirements, Mrs. Caldwell. You're still legally bound to your Philadelphia marriage regardless of subsequent ceremonies, and your husband has provided evidence of fraud in your territorial marriage application." The accusation struck at the heart of Sarah's greatest vulnerability. Her marriage to James Harrison had been based on falsified identity documents that wouldn't survive serious federal investigation. If Pierce could prove that Sarah Mitchell didn't exist, he could invalidate her territorial marriage and her legal guardianship of the children. "What evidence?" James Harrison asked, his voice carrying the edge that appeared whenever he perceived threats to his family. "What specifically is my wife accused of?" Pierce produced a manila folder thick with documents that appeared to chronicle every aspect of Sarah's flight from Philadelphia: forged identity papers, train tickets purchased under false names, correspondence with James Harrison that had been intercepted by Thomas Caldwell's associates. The thoroughness of the investigation revealed resources and connections that far exceeded normal police capabilities. "Your wife is wanted for theft of marital property," Pierce explained, consulting his files. "Mr. Caldwell has documented the removal of jewelry, cash, and other valuables that legally belonged to the marital estate. The total value exceeds federal thresholds for interstate theft." The charges were technically accurate, but morally obscene. Sarah had indeed taken jewelry and cash when she fled Philadelphia, but only enough to fund her escape from a man who had beaten her unconscious for discovering his criminal operations. Thomas was using theft laws to criminalize her survival, turning her desperation into legal grounds for forced return. More disturbing, Pierce's presence at Cedar Creek Ranch revealed that Thomas had tracked her down despite her careful efforts to disappear. The criminal connections that had made Thomas dangerous in Philadelphia apparently extended far enough to locate fugitive wives in remote Montana territories. "There's also the matter of the children," Pierce continued, gesturing toward Emma Patterson and several others who had gathered on the front porch to observe the confrontation. "Mr. Caldwell's associates have been researching your situation here, and they've identified irregularities in these children's legal status that could prove embarrassing if examined closely." The threat was clear. Thomas Caldwell possessed enough information about the children's escape from Riverside Industrial School to cause serious problems for their newly secured guardianship arrangements. If federal authorities reopened questions about harboring escaped state wards, it could unravel everything they had built together. Sarah realized with crystalline clarity that this confrontation had been inevitable since the day she boarded the train in Philadelphia. Thomas Caldwell's criminal pride and possessive nature would never accept her escape, regardless of geographic distance or legal complications. He would pursue her across any distance and through any obstacles until he either reclaimed control over her or destroyed her life so completely that escape became meaningless. But Sarah also understood something that Detective Pierce and Thomas Caldwell had failed to anticipate. She was no longer the isolated, terrorized woman who had fled. Philadelphia 13 months earlier, she had 15 children who depended on her protection, a husband who valued her partnership, and a community that had witnessed her transformation from victim to guardian. "Detective Pierce," Sarah said, making a decision that surprised her with its certainty. "I'd like you to meet some people before you make any final decisions about my legal status." What followed was unlike any law enforcement encounter Pierce had probably experienced in his career. Instead of denying charges or attempting to negotiate, Sarah systematically introduced him to every person whose life had been transformed by her presence at Cedar Creek Ranch. Emma Patterson, now 12 years old and radiating confidence that would have been impossible under institutional care, explained how Sarah's rescue had literally saved her life during the blizzard that had nearly killed 15 children. Her articulate description of their survival, Sarah's leadership, and the community they had built together painted a picture of heroism rather than criminality. Michael Chen and David Rodriguez detailed the ranch operations they now managed, emphasizing Sarah's role in developing systems that had transformed struggling children into productive young adults. Their mathematical precision in describing agricultural yields, livestock management, and business operations demonstrated capabilities that institutionalized children rarely developed. Dr. Patricia Reynolds, who happened to be visiting the ranch for routine medical examinations, provided professional testimony about the children's remarkable physical and psychological development under Sarah's guardianship. Her medical documentation revealed transformation from malnourished, traumatized institutional residents to thriving individuals with bright future prospects. But the most powerful testimony came from James Harrison himself, who spoke with quiet authority about his wife's character, capabilities, and crucial role in creating the most successful ranch operation in the territory. His description of their partnership, both personal and professional, revealed a relationship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to children's welfare. "Detective Pierce," Harrison concluded, "you're asking me to surrender the best person I've ever known to a man who apparently beats women and operates criminal enterprises. Even if the law supports such action, basic human decency doesn't." Pierce's response revealed the complexity of his own position. As a law enforcement officer, he was bound to enforce legal requirements, regardless of personal sympathy. But as someone who had spent 20 years investigating domestic cases, he recognized the patterns of abuse and control that Thomas Caldwell's behavior represented. "Mrs. Harrison," Pierce said, his tone shifting towards something approaching respect, "I can see what you've built here, and I understand why you wouldn't want to abandon it. But the law is clear about interstate flight and fraudulent marriage. I have warrants that require me to return you to Philadelphia for trial." The standoff that followed stretched through the afternoon as Pierce wrestled with obligations that conflicted with obvious justice. Sarah's crimes were technical violations driven by desperation to escape genuine victimization. Her accomplishments at Cedar Creek Ranch demonstrated rehabilitation and positive contribution to society. Returning her to Thomas Caldwell's custody would almost certainly result in violence that could prove fatal. The resolution came from an unexpected source. As evening approached and Pierce prepared to execute his warrants, a second rider appeared. On the trail to Cedar Creek Ranch, this visitor was U.S. Marshal William Thompson, the same federal officer who had encountered Sarah and the children during their journey to the ranch over a year earlier. Thompson's arrival wasn't coincidental. He had been investigating Thomas Caldwell's criminal operations for months, building a federal case that would eventually result in prosecution for smuggling, racketeering, and conspiracy. His investigation had uncovered evidence that Caldwell had used police resources inappropriately to track down his estranged wife. "Detective Pierce," Thompson said, after examining Pierce's warrants and documentation, "I'm going to have to ask you to suspend these proceedings pending federal investigation of the complainant. Thomas Caldwell is the subject of ongoing criminal investigation, and his allegations against his wife may constitute obstruction of justice." The legal technicalities that followed were complex, but their practical effect was simple. Sarah's case would be transferred to federal jurisdiction where Thomas Caldwell's criminal activities would be evaluated alongside his claims about his wife's theft. Given his documented history of domestic violence and his current status as a federal fugitive, his credibility as a complainant was seriously compromised. More importantly, Thompson's investigation had revealed that Thomas Caldwell was using law enforcement resources to pursue personal vendettas rather than legitimate criminal complaints. Pierce's assignment to locate Sarah had been improperly obtained through false representations about the nature of the case. "Mrs. Harrison," Thompson said, as Pierce prepared to depart without executing his warrants, "I can't guarantee what federal prosecutors will decide about your case, but I can tell you that Thomas Caldwell won't be in a position to pursue you much longer. We expect to arrest him within the month." The victory felt hollow despite its completeness. Sarah had successfully defended against legal challenges that could have destroyed her new life, but the confrontation had revealed how precarious her security remained. Thomas Caldwell's criminal connections apparently extended further than she had realized, and his willingness to use law enforcement for personal retaliation suggested resources that could threaten her indefinitely. But the episode had also demonstrated something crucial about the community she had helped create. When serious threats emerged, 15 children and their adult allies had rallied to protect someone who had sacrificed for their welfare. The mutual support that had preserved them all during desperate circumstances now provided security against external dangers. As Pierce departed and normal ranch routines resumed, Emma Patterson approached Sarah with the kind of mature wisdom that no longer surprised anyone who knew her well. "Miss Sarah," Emma said, using the title she had maintained despite Sarah's marriage and changing circumstances. "We know you came here running away from something, but you can't run away from someone who won't stop chasing. Sometimes you have to turn around and face what's following you." The observation was profound enough to reshape Sarah's understanding of her situation. For over a year, she had been focused on building new life, while hoping that Thomas Caldwell would eventually give up his pursuit. But Emma was right. Some threats required confrontation rather than evasion. "What are you suggesting?" Sarah asked. "I'm suggesting," Emma replied with the determination that had kept 15 children alive in desperate circumstances, "that maybe it's time to stop running from Thomas Caldwell and start making sure he can't hurt anyone else the way he hurt you." The idea was radical and dangerous, but it aligned with Sarah's growing understanding of her own transformation. She had evolved from victim to protector, from someone seeking safety to someone providing it. Perhaps her final evolution required becoming someone who actively confronted the sources of danger rather than simply escaping from them. As autumn deepened toward winter and news arrived that Thomas Caldwell had indeed been arrested by federal authorities, Sarah began planning something she had never imagined possible, returning to Philadelphia not as a fugitive seeking to hide, but as a witness prepared to ensure that Thomas Caldwell could never again terrorize the people he claimed to own. 3. Years after Detective Pierce's visit to Cedar Creek Ranch, Sarah Harrison stood in a Philadelphia courthouse wearing a navy dress that commanded respect rather than the tattered coat she had worn while fleeing this same city. The woman who had once cowered in fear of Thomas Caldwell now faced him across a courtroom as the prosecution's star witness in a federal racketeering trial that would determine whether he spent the rest of his life in prison. The journey from Montana to Philadelphia had been Sarah's choice, a decision that surprised everyone who knew her story. When federal prosecutors contacted Cedar Creek Ranch, requesting her testimony against Thomas Caldwell's criminal organization, Sarah could have declined. Her new identity as Sarah Harrison was legally protected, her children were safe, and her life in Montana offered everything she had once desperately sought. But Emma Patterson's words about turning to face what was chasing her had planted a seed that grew into something larger than personal safety. Sarah realized that testifying against Thomas wouldn't just protect her own future, it would protect every other woman trapped in his web of violence and criminal exploitation. The investigation that had brought Thomas Caldwell to trial revealed an operation far more extensive than Sarah had understood during her marriage. Thomas hadn't just been smuggling opium and stolen goods. He had been trafficking women, using his charm and resources to lure vulnerable immigrants into marriages that became forms of enslaved labor. Sarah had been one victim among dozens, women who had disappeared into his criminal network without anyone to advocate for their freedom. Mrs. Harrison, Federal Prosecutor Margaret Chen, addressed Sarah as she took the witness stand. "Please tell the court about your marriage to the defendant and the circumstances that led to your departure from Philadelphia." The testimony that followed was the most difficult thing Sarah had ever done, but also the most necessary. For 3 hours, she detailed the progression of Thomas's abuse, the discovery of his criminal activities, and the violence that had driven her to risk everything on escape to an unknown future. Her words filled the courtroom with a silence so profound that even the court reporter seemed to pause in her transcription. But Sarah's testimony went beyond personal victimization. Her 3 years of building a new life had given her perspective on what recovery from trauma actually looked like. She could describe not just what Thomas had done to her, but how she had overcome it, how she had transformed from victim to protector of others who needed advocacy. "The defendant destroyed the person I was," Sarah said during the most crucial moment of her testimony, looking directly at Thomas for the first time in 4 years. "But he couldn't prevent me from becoming the person I was meant to be." The 15 children I now raise learned that survival isn't just about escaping danger. It's about building something better than what you're running from. Thomas's reaction to seeing Sarah was everything she had feared, and more than she had hoped. His face showed the rage she remembered from their worst arguments, but also something new, the frustration of a predator who had lost control over his intended victim. He had expected to reclaim a terrified woman who would beg for mercy. Instead, he faced someone who had found strength he couldn't understand or intimidate. The defense attorney's cross-examination attempted to portray Sarah as an unreliable witness whose testimony was motivated by revenge rather than justice. He questioned her memory of events from 4 years earlier, suggested that her current circumstances had colored her interpretation of past experiences, and implied that her flight from Philadelphia indicated consciousness of guilt rather than fear of violence. Sarah's responses revealed how completely her perspective had changed during her years at Cedar Creek Ranch. The woman who had once been paralyzed by Thomas's psychological manipulation now addressed hostile questioning with calm precision, never allowing emotion to undermine the factual accuracy of her testimony. "Are you testifying against my client because you want revenge for perceived wrongs?" the defense attorney asked during his most aggressive questioning. "I'm testifying because 15 children taught me that protecting people from predators is more important than protecting yourself from discomfort," Sarah replied. "Your client destroyed many lives before mine and would destroy many more if he remains free to do so." The trial lasted 2 weeks, with Sarah's testimony supported by evidence from a dozen other witnesses who detailed Thomas's criminal operations. Women who had escaped his trafficking network, business associates who had discovered his fraud and smuggling activities, law enforcement officers who had been investigating his organization for years. But the most powerful moment came when Emma Patterson, now 15 years old and poised beyond her years, was permitted to address the court about how Sarah's transformation had affected the children she protected. "Your Honor," Emma said, standing at the witness podium with dignity that would have been impossible during her years at Riverside Industrial School. "Sarah Harrison saved my life and 14 others when we were buried in snow and certain to die. But that's not why I'm here today." Emma's testimony described the community they had built at Cedar Creek Ranch, the educational and economic opportunities that had transformed institutional refugees into productive young adults, and the leadership lessons they had learned from watching Sarah overcome her own trauma while protecting others. "Miss Sarah taught us that being a victim doesn't define you," Emma continued. "What defines you is what you do with the strength you discover after surviving. She could have stayed hidden in Montana, but she came here because stopping predators matters more than personal safety." The jury's verdict, delivered after only 4 hours of deliberation, found Thomas Caldwell guilty on all 17 federal charges, including racketeering, human trafficking, fraud, and conspiracy. The judge's sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole meant that Thomas would never again threaten Sarah or any other woman. But the trial's conclusion wasn't the end of Sarah's journey. It was the beginning of something larger that would define the rest of her life. The publicity surrounding the Caldwell trial had attracted attention from women's advocacy organizations, federal agencies investigating human trafficking, and journalists documenting stories of survival and recovery. Sarah found herself invited to speak at conferences, consult with law enforcement agencies, and advise social service organizations about recognizing and addressing domestic violence. More importantly, the trial had connected her with other survivors of Thomas's criminal network, women who had escaped or been rescued but lacked the resources and support systems that had enabled Sarah's recovery. Their stories revealed needs that existing social services weren't adequately addressing. The solution Sarah developed drew on everything she had learned about community building during her years at Cedar Creek Ranch. Working with federal authorities and women's advocacy groups, she proposed establishing a network of rural recovery centers where trafficking survivors could rebuild their lives through meaningful work and mutual support. The first center, established on land adjacent to Cedar Creek Ranch, became a model for recovery programs that treated survivors as capable individuals rather than helpless victims. Women arrived traumatized and isolated, but they left with job skills, educational credentials, and most importantly, the kind of community relationships that provided ongoing support and stability. Emma Patterson, now 18 and preparing for college on academic scholarships she had earned through her ranch education, played a crucial role in developing programs for the Recovery Center. Her experience surviving institutional abuse and building new life through community cooperation provided insights that professional social workers couldn't offer. Healing happens when people have control over their own lives and meaningful relationships with others who understand their experiences, Emma explained during a presentation to federal funding agencies. You can't recover from trauma in isolation, but you also can't recover if other people are making all your decisions for you. The Recovery Center's success attracted attention from throughout the Western Territories, leading to requests for similar programs in other states. Sarah found herself traveling extensively, consulting with organizations that wanted to replicate the community-based approach she had pioneered. But her most important work remained at Cedar Creek Ranch, where 15 children who had once been buried in snow were now young adults preparing for careers and families of their own. Their individual achievements represented the ultimate validation of Sarah's transformation from victim to guardian. Michael Chen had earned acceptance to agricultural college and planned to return to Montana as a ranching consultant. David Rodriguez had developed innovative irrigation techniques that were being adopted throughout the territory. Lucy and Margaret Williams, the youngest survivors of their escape from Riverside, were now accomplished students whose academic achievements had earned them scholarships to Eastern universities. Most remarkably, all 15 maintained the community bonds that had preserved them during their most desperate circumstances. They had created what social workers called chosen family, relationships based on mutual support and shared values rather than biological connection. James Harrison's role in their success couldn't be overstated. His willingness to accept responsibility for 15 children had provided the legal and financial foundation that made their recovery possible. But more than that, his partnership with Sarah had demonstrated that functional families could be created through commitment and cooperation, rather than traditional structures. I thought I was getting a mail-order bride to help manage my ranch, James reflected during the celebration of their 5th wedding anniversary. Instead, I got a partner who transformed my isolated cattle operation into the most important community development project in Montana Territory. The anniversary celebration brought together everyone whose life had been touched by Sarah's journey from desperation to purpose. Federal prosecutors who had worked on the Caldwell case, social workers who had learned from the Recovery Center model, neighboring ranchers who had witnessed the children's transformation from institutional refugees to community leaders. But the most meaningful recognition came from the children themselves, now young adults who understood how extraordinary Their survival and success had been Miss Sarah, Emma Patterson said during the evening's formal presentations, using the title she had maintained despite all their changed circumstances. You found us buried in snow, but you didn't just dig us out. You taught us how to build lives worth living. The comment captured something essential about Sarah's transformation that went beyond personal recovery or even community building. She had discovered that healing from trauma required not just escaping danger, but actively creating safety for others who faced similar threats. As autumn arrived at Cedar Creek Ranch and another school year began for the Recovery Center residents, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from Philadelphia to Montana to a life she could never have imagined. The terrified woman who had fled Thomas Caldwell's violence had become someone who testified against federal criminals. The desperate refugee who had sought any escape from abuse had become someone who created opportunities for other survivors. The mail-order bride who had hoped for nothing more than anonymous safety had become a guardian angel whose influence extended far beyond the children she had originally saved. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was in her understanding of what strength actually meant. During her marriage to Thomas, she had believed that strength meant enduring abuse without complaint. During her flight to Montana, she had thought strength meant surviving alone. Now she understood that real strength meant building communities where everyone could thrive, facing dangers to protect others, and using her own recovery to create opportunities for people who were still trapped in circumstances she had escaped. Standing on the porch of Cedar Creek Ranch as evening light faded across the mountains, Sarah counted the lights appearing in windows throughout their expanded community. The main ranch house where she and James lived with their own adopted daughter, a trafficking survivor who had arrived as a toddler. The recovery center where 8 women were currently rebuilding their lives. The homes of young adults who had once been 15 children buried in snow. Each light represented someone who had found safety and purpose through the community networks Sarah had helped create. But more than that, each person had become someone who extended protection and opportunity to others who needed advocacy and support. The mail-order bride who had once sought only to escape her problems had discovered that her greatest fulfillment came from solving problems for others. The woman who had been buried in despair had learned to unbury potential in people whom society had written off as hopeless cases. And the 15 children who had taught her about survival had grown into adults who were teaching new generations about the difference between existing and thriving, between escaping danger and building something beautiful from the pieces of broken lives. As winter approached and another year of guardian angel work began, Sarah Harrison smiled at the thought of what tomorrow might bring. Somewhere, there were probably people buried in circumstances as desperate as a Montana blizzard, waiting for someone to notice their situation and care enough to start digging. She had learned that being a guardian angel didn't require wings or supernatural powers. It just required recognizing that everyone deserved the chance to transform their survival into something that helped others survive as well. The snow would fall again this winter, as it always did in the mountains. But Sarah Harrison and her extended family would be ready for it, with warm shelters, adequate supplies, and most importantly, the kind of community relationships that could weather any storm that nature or human predators might create. After all, guardian angels weren't born in heaven. They were forged in the fires of their own survival, then refined through the joy of helping others discover their own strength to overcome whatever had tried to bury them alive. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.